Welcome, Tansy, everyone. I'm Christine Ramsey. I'm the Associate Dean of Grad and Research in the Faculty of MAP. And I would like to welcome you all to the inaugural Doctoral Research Showcase. And we have a very interesting panel today, Walking Art Practices, 4 perspectives from Canada and the UK. I will say just a few brief remarks about the Doctoral Research Showcase, and then we will proceed. We have a few people who are here to bring greetings. And this is a co-production between the Faculty of MAP and the Humanities Research Institute. And we have the director here with us, Dr. Charity Marsh, who will speak briefly, and then we'll carry on. So let me just first let you know that the showcase, as I said, is a partnership between MAP and the HRI. It's an opportunity for candidates in the interdisciplinary PhD in media and artistic research to profile and disseminate their research, test their ideas, and prepare to defend their theses and research creation projects in an engaged environment of you, professors, peers, the campus community, as well as their national and international academic, arts, and culture networks. It also plays an important role in supporting and promoting the mandate of the HRI here at the University of Regina to advance humanities scholarship and research and develop innovation, interdisciplinarity, and collaboration, enhancing the scholarly life and reputation of the university while contributing to the development and success of our students. So that's why we're here today. And our first DRS Showcase PhD candidate is Ken Wilson, and we will be introducing him and the panel in a few moments. But first, I'd just like to invite Dr. Charity Marsh, who is, as I said, the director of the HRI, to bring greetings and a land acknowledgement. Thanks, Charity.
Thanks, Christine. Welcome, everyone. Let's turn first to the land acknowledgement, which is an important part of the ongoing work that we should be doing and that we are doing at the University of Regina around processes of reconciliation. So I'm speaking with you virtually from my home, which is in Regina and located on Treaty 4 territory. And I want to take this moment to acknowledge that the lands here that University of Regina is on are Treaty 4 with a presence in Treaty 6, and that these territories are the lands of the Anishinaabe, the Nahea, sorry, I got a bit nervous, sorry. It's always, I find the land acknowledgement always such an important and so emotional. And so the Naheawa, the Lakota, the Nakota, and the Dakota peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis and the Michif Nation. And I think importantly to acknowledge that as a white settler who is recognizing and understanding the ongoing responsibility that we have to reflect deeply on past and ongoing atrocities that are embedded in the processes of colonialism, and the ways that we continue, for myself and my family, that I continue to benefit from colonialism, and that we need to be constantly thinking about this and acting. So as a scholar here at the U of R, as well as the director of the HRI, I'm committed to participating in programs of research and teaching and learning and mentoring that are grounded in self-reflection and critique, engagement, action, activism, and social justice. And we, as a person, as a human, but within all of those roles as well, that I'm continually seeking out new ways to enact and contribute to meaningful processes of anti-colonial work, reconciliation, and hopefully decolonization. And so as the HRI, I'm very excited from the director's point of view to be here, to be involved in this new initiative. I want to thank Ken for being the first. This is exciting for you, exciting for us, and exciting for MAP. As well, thank you to Christine for all of the ongoing organization, and to the panelists. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say and to learn from you and to engage in some lively, rich discussion. So again, thank you so much for being here, and we're really excited to have everyone.
Thank you very much, Charity. So now I would like to introduce Dr. Aziz Douai, who is our Dean of the Faculty of Grad Studies and Research, and he will bring a few words of greeting.
Thank you so much, Christine, and thank you so much, Charity, for that touching acknowledgement, land acknowledgement. My remarks are going to be brief, but I want to first thank Dean Ray and Christine, as well as Charity, for their leadership and the kind invitation. As I said, my remarks are going to be very brief, as I would like also to highlight some exciting aspects of this event. The Doctoral Research Showcase is, for me personally, an exciting venue that brings together graduate students, supervisors, and faculty members across units and disciplines on campus and beyond for dialogue on and profile of, and as well as engagement with advanced student research. The connections, innovation, and potential collaboration that this showcase is facilitating will be tremendously impactful and contribute to our reputation as a doctoral and interdisciplinary minded and focused grad school. Of course, this would not happen without the MAP and HRI campus partnership to profile doctoral work in the humanities. Our doctoral students are really a powerhouse of creativity and innovation, and I'm really excited to get a glimpse of their work at today's event. The on-campus intellectual dialogue enriches all of us and helps us forge ahead together as an institution that thrives on interdisciplinary collaboration, creative and innovative inquiry. And I just want to conclude again by thanking you and Ken for organizing this exciting event. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Aziz. Now I would love to turn to Ray Stasis, the Dean of MAP, who is going to introduce Ken Wilson, the candidate.
Thank you, Christine. Hello, everybody. It's wonderful to be here this morning for the inaugural DRS event. It's a great collaboration, and I look forward to many more in the future. It's a great honor to be able to introduce Ken Wilson, MAP PhD candidate. At this event, Walking Art Practices, 4 Perspectives from Canada and the UK. As we are showcasing the work of Ken Wilson, his practice is based in walking art. He has published several journal articles and book chapters on his PhD research. And in 2019, he was invited by the Office of the Vice President Research to present Walking and Decolonization at From Truth to Reconciliation, Renewing Relationships with Indigenous People, Casa Canada Festival, Internacional Cervantino, Guanajuato, Mexico. Ken is also a board member of the Sage Hill Writing Experience, and his supervisors are Dr. Sherry Farrell-Racette, Visual Arts in the Faculty of MAP, and Dr. James Daschuk from the Faculty of Kinesiology and Health Studies at the University of Regina. His committee members are Dr. Jesse Archibald Barber from First Nations University of Canada, Kathryn Bracht, Theatre Department in MAP, Dr. Kathleen Irwin, Professor Emerita, Theatre Department, MAP, and Dr. Michael Trussler from the English Department, Faculty of Arts, all from the University of Regina. So without further ado, Ken Wilson, it's all yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ray. So now let me introduce, and then we truly will get started, Dr. Sheila Petty. Dr. Petty will moderate the panel for us, and Sheila is a professor in the Department of Film in the Faculty of MAP and a recent recipient of the Fellowship of the Royal Society of Canada. So Sheila, please.
Thanks very much, Christine. Welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many people here today. Thank you for organizing this, and congratulations, Ken. This is wonderful. Wonderful showcase. I was sort of hoping that you'd have us all walk the bypass while we did this, but I guess that's not going to happen. It's a little chilly out there today. I see it's 1 degree, But anyways, we'll carry on with this format, which looks absolutely fabulous. So what I'm going to do is introduce each person, and then they're going to speak. And everyone has 20 minutes for their presentation. And at the end, that gives us a nice chunk of time for discussion around the table. So we're going to begin with Phil Smith. Phil Smith is a performance maker, writer, and academic researcher, specializing in work around walking, site specificity, and mythogeographies. He is an associate professor, that is reader, at the University of Plymouth. With visual artist Helen Billinghurst, he is one half of Crab and Bee, creating the 2018-2019 exhibition and walking project, Plymouth Labyrinth, and publishing The Pattern 2020 with Triarchy Press. He is author of Making Site-Specific Theatre and Performance 2020 through Red Globe, and with Tony Whitehead and photographer John Schott, he wrote Guidebook for an Armchair Pilgrimage in 2019, and the related novel Bone Lines in 2020 and Covert 2021 for a subjectivity protective movement practice with Canada-based choreographer Melanie Klotzel. With Claire Hind and Helen Billinghurst, he co-organized the 2019 Walking's New Movements Conference at the University of Plymouth and co-edited papers and provocations from the conference in Walking Bodies, 2020 Triarchy Press. Since 1980, Phil has been company dramaturg for TNT, that's Theatre Munich. His and TNT's artistic director, Paul Stebbings' book about the company, TNT, The New Theatre, was published in 2020. So very outstanding, Phil. Over to you, take it away. We're anxious to hear what you have to say. And I don't think we have any sound, do we? Phil, are you there?
I think he got disconnected.
Hi, I am Sheila. The moment you mentioned my name, the internet dropped out. So I am, as you can see, on a very unstable line. In the event that I drop out again, I think that Ken has the materials to carry on for me. So I'm going to try and share my screen now, and let's just see how we get on. So first of all, let me say what a pleasure it is to participate in this event with and for Ken. All the work of Ken's that I've ever read displays remarkable attention to detail and deep understanding. And it's a big ask to try and come into this event at that kind of level, but here goes. So during the Walking's New Movements Conference in Plymouth in November 2019, I detected a pattern among the presentations, which was a surprise, as immediately prior to that, I'd struggled to find any shape to the walking arts movement. This hasn't always been so. In a 2008 paper, The Contemporary Derive, I was confident enough to trace a line of resistance against romanticist walking that included psychogeography, fluxus, and occultism, to individual contemporary artists working with land and performance. Later in 2008, I was present when the remnants of the 1990s psychogeographical associations and younger artists came together at the TRIP conference in Manchester. If there were tensions there, they were meaningful. One of the evident contradictions was the marginalization of women. 6 years later, I had no problem listing 100 women walking artists from memory in On Walking. That was an observable trend. But along with expansion and variable diversification, there were broader negative developments. In 2016, I responded at book length to the accelerating hollowing out of public spaces, the war on subjectivity, and the uncovering of spaces of violent privilege. There were problems in radical walking itself, nascent commercialization, the subtle return to romanticism, and the misidentifying of modest localist events as somehow subversive. I was also worried by the impact of new nature writing, dragging radical walking into bucolic illusion. The expansion of the walking arts movement that occurred in the early 2010s, largely unrecognized alliance of those driven by
I think his internet got disconnected.
Yeah, I think we just lost Phil. Sheila, I have Phil's paper. Would you like me to carry
Yes.
on, or do you want to give him a minute to maybe?
We could give him a minute, but yeah, Ken, I think you're going to have to jump in when
Okay.
needed, if possible.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I still see his PowerPoint on the screen, which
Yes.
is odd if he's been.
Yeah, his
Okay.
PowerPoint is still there.
Oh, okay. Now it's
Now
gone.
it's not. Yeah.
Now it's out.
Oh, okay. I'm just trying to find where he was. The expansion of the walking arts movement that occurred in the early 2010s began from a largely unrecognized alliance of those driven by the politics of the dérive as a means to disrupt capitalist alienation and artists and performers working in land art or live art. This expansion quickly drew in people with quite different functional priorities: meditation, mental health, planning and design, adventuresome tour guiding, nature walking, entrepreneurship, and so on. As a model for responding to this dispersiveness, I advocated a situational dérive that reunited an explorative psychogeography with an interventionist disruption of the spectacle. Indeed, my first ever conference paper was a critique of the division of the tactic of the dérive from the situationist critique of the spectacle. In 2016, however, I was trying to heal a rift within the dérive itself. At the same time, I argued for ludibria on a large scale, deploying the art of memory to re-encode existing architectures and landscapes so as to radically change their meanings without having to rebuild their structures. Neither suggestion had much effect, and I increasingly advocated being quiet and watchful until the prevailing conditions and agencies changed, though I wasn't very good at following my own advice. It was surprising and exciting then when at the 2019 Plymouth Conference, a partial consensus around the importance of embodiment and of giving attention to unhuman partners emerged, apparently spontaneously. Compared to the other resources and forces I had previously hoped might empower a walking arts movement, those of our own bodies and of unhuman others seemed far more viable. Since the conference, maybe because of the restrictions of the COVID pandemic, my optimism has been tempered. I returned to my research in 2016 for my Walking's New Movements book. I had attempted a survey of accounts about and by UK radical walkers prior to 2008. I had been shocked at how superficial much of their actual walking was. The number of times the aged tactic of using the map of one city to navigate another was cited was disheartening. Indeed, without the much abused literary and occult psychogeographers, it was hard to find any development of ideas around radical walking that got any further than reciting Guy Debord's Theory of the Dérive article of 1958. In other words, after 2008, the walking movement was pretty much built from the ground up. No wonder then that it was hard to detect patterns. So few structures had been laid down in practice, and even fewer had been reinforced by repetition and development. which may explain the plethora of disparate interests and motivations in radical walking, and why certain figures and groups stand out powerfully from the churning of micro-initiatives. Morag Rose and the Loiterers Resistance Movement, Claire Qualman and the Walking Arts Network, Dee Hedden and Misha Myers' Walking Library, Testament's Black Men Walking, the Fife Psychogeography Collective, the Fourth World Congress of Psychogeography, Blake Morris and his Memory Theaters, Monique Beston's Solo Walking, groups or individuals who articulated or facilitated through their organizing patterns of practice. Yet documentation and communication across these and other activities was piecemeal. The sum of disparate practices was often bewildering in its range and fragmentation. And the one really major collective organization, the Walking Arts Network, which for a couple of years of AHRC-funded research regularly brought walkers together for collective events, eventually resolved itself into an open platform for exchanges of unfiltered information. The openness and variegated nature of the walking movement may be its key virtues, yet despite, maybe because of, its hundreds of participants, many of them in academia, there are few theorizations of radical walking. Blake Morris's Walking Networks, Sonia Overall's work, and I've tried, but nothing has emerged in any way comparable to the influence of, say, Frederick Gross's A Philosophy of Walking, Robert McFarlane's The Old Ways, or the many new nature books to reassert the primacy of romanticism. To get some sense of what effect this vacuum might have had on walking artists and activists, I reviewed 2 years of correspondence on the Walking Artists Network Gistmail site and the 80+ walking art projects recently collected on the Walk Create online gallery. Rather than any sustained discussion of practices or theory, I found that the posts on the Walking Artists Network mostly promoted events or products, most important being audio walks, mapping, walking for well-being and resilience, though all these subjects have tailed off recently. The mail is dominated by regular posts from producer, facilitator, and entrepreneurial organizations like the Museum of Walking and Walk, Listen, Create, who promote their events and online talks. The only posts that had provoked any extended discussion were ones about walking and drawing, clothing, and gait in a film of 1911 Walkers in New York, and walking in and together with different bodies. The decolonization of walking was mentioned a number of times. I got a very different picture when I reviewed the 80+ walking arts projects in the Walk Create gallery, mostly generated around COVID lockdowns by groups and individual walking artists. There were recurrent themes of a reclamation of subjectivity, of a common fragility, and of a porosity of walkers in relation to their landscapes and unhuman others, which were often urban or edgelands rather than countryside. Almost entirely absent was any bucolic romanticism or recourse to psychogeography's ontological themes. Now, it may be that my failures from 2008 onwards to identify and sustain any discernible and sustainable coherence for the movement of radical walkers is because the components of the movement are incoherent. Or it may be that there is no movement, that what has previously appeared as a coagulation of different tendencies and activities either never fully firmed up or did, but subsequently broke up. Whichever it was, in the vacuum, subjectivity and individualism now predominate. And while there continue to be some political and communal walking actions, there is no sign that, despite Blake Morris's theorization of walking networks, they are anywhere close to becoming a web with regular connections and communications. Conducting the surveys and trying to write this paper has been difficult. I have been obliged to rethink many past assumptions, not just because I was wrong in the past, but because this is not that past. The radical walking that attracted me around the millennium sprang from the anti-capitalism of post-war European activists who rejected the party disciplines of Stalinists and embraced a Marcusean liberation of subjectivity, eros, desire, and exploration of irrational zones of consciousness beyond the reach of mass media. Yet despite its subjectivism, that project was still rooted in a belief in the potential agency of collectivities. It made itself dependent on the power of classes that barely exist now, not even as specters, as Derrida has it. Perhaps significantly, the most successful entity in staving off the tendency to fragmentation is the Fourth World Congress of Psychogeography, a group closer than anyone to the situation at source. And yet, If the great materially based, economically grounded collectivities have effectively gone, what meaning do the subsets of such collectivities like the Fourth World Congress, or indeed a movement of radical walking artists, have? In my 2016 book, Walking's New Movement, I proposed that the best response to the threat of a return of romanticism was to out-romantic the romantics. For if one attended closely to what contemporary romantic theorists like Frederick Gross were proposing, it was a rather lukewarm relationship with the unhuman, exciting maybe to a desk-bound academic, but hardly a challenge to the mainstream spectacle of the bucolic. In contrast, the kinds of immersion practiced by some radical walkers passed through a romantic fusion and came out the other side. Perversely, the most powerful path emerging from our walking movement seemed to be a subjective one. And so, now, faced with the dissolution of the last remnants of European social democracy and sociability, along with the triumph of neoliberalism in the very moment of its falling apart, maybe it is time to stop worrying about a radical walking movement as such, to stop trying to imagine or engineer social organizations of walking built on material interests and connections, and instead, in the face of neoliberal capitalism's war on the individual, to work through the medium of an idolized yet threatened individualism. As with romanticism, perhaps, so with individualism. In the same way that some radical walkers have been driven into romanticism and come through to something beyond, maybe something similar is possible for individualism. Maybe the terrain we need to explore next is not the edgelands, but the irrational, the edgelands of our minds. And yet, of course, there is no we who needs. There is no our or we I can speak of or for. Instead, maybe it's better to ask, where do the webs of irrationality and threads of fantasy attach to unhuman matters, and can I attach myself to? If the material forces and social relations of humans no longer provide the grounds for collective structures, maybe imagination and mysteries can. A powerful message from the Plymouth Conference, affirmed by the works on the Walk Create site, is that any such subjectivism can be embodied. There is no Gnostic transcendence necessary here. So while there might be a turn inwards, there is at the same time a turn outwards through the body to the unhuman others of the path, the rocks and stags and paving slabs and rivers, both by direct physical encounters and attending to, but also by the subjective telling of these our others, by the mystery tales of them. I'm not talking about convincing myself that I'm wandering about in Narnia or Mordor, but attending to stories that are still common currency, evinced by work such as Sam George's analysis of the return of Old Stinker, the Hull werewolf, stories in common circulation that carry information about transcorporeality, about the passage of materials between unhuman and human agents. Attending where these stories become, as my colleague Helen Billinghurst has named it, the organizing principle of a place. There are no obvious useful prospects for this, just the doing and the finding out. And in the telling, maybe a finding out, but only by walking out with the hedgerows and birdsong tangles to the wounded deer, white goods trash in the sward, and arsenic spoil heaps by the river are the stories likely to uncurl. By giving up on the idea of a movement, I have now forfeited what right I might have had to address what anyone else should be doing. After 2008, there were small groups of walkers, it seemed, might coalesce around a more general collective project of some emergent kind. That didn't happen. Now, even the idea of it seems remote. Instead, my address is to my relations, to deer, wolves, grass verges, suburban valleys, buzzards predating on pheasant poults, and the tales of the head of Bran, the blessed raven, and the werewolves under the bramble patch by St. John. I once read a piece by two radical US walkers who wanted to point out how the Situationist derive was more appropriate to ancient Paris than modern USA, where, in their words, even East Coast buildings are rarely more than 100 years old. That's a kind of colonial chronology I have to free myself from, for which I require a change of scale, to make alliances with mutations that emerge very slowly. Just because the Western white upper and middle classes have suddenly realized that their way of life is under threat doesn't mean that global majority populations haven't suffered the same ending of their way of life hundreds and hundreds of times already. As I now walk through formerly industrial landscapes from which the silver was extracted to mint the coins that raised the fleets to colonize and enslave, there have been many, many apocalypses here. But I see the clump of heather growing on the 150-year-old arsenic spoil. I meet the young fallow stag in the car park. I can't detect much clear meaning yet, but I sense a shift in walking arts, and I want to push it further for myself from a previous focus on the psychogeographical affects on human subjects to a shared activity with the unhuman players in these wounded spaces, attending to their place stories, their metals, their subterranean networks, and their possible sites of future rewilding. Animism, decolonization, and challenges to anthropocentric perspectives are on the rise, and I wish to seek out fractures in past apocalypses through which to walk and plant. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ken and Phil. Very thought-provoking. You were under by 2 minutes. Yes, absolutely fabulous, but lots to think about there. So very good. Thank you very much for taking over, Ken.
Oh, you're welcome. And I apologize to everyone that I wasn't able to get Phil's PowerPoint to work well, reading the text off my screen at the same time. So there were images to accompany everything, and I was unable to show them.
Okay, that's fine. We'll carry on. Thank you, Ken. We are now going to turn to Ivan Pope, who is our next presenter. Ivan Pope is a writer of fiction and psychogeographic nonfiction, artist and long-distance cyclist. He graduated from Goldsmiths College of Fine Art with a BA and with the YBA generation. He invented the Cyber Cafe and founded the world's first web magazine. He has taught at art colleges in London, Newport, and Brighton. He is currently undertaking a PhD in creative nonfiction at Plymouth University. Over to you, Ivan.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's really great to be here just to say this. And I just wanted to say that I really appreciated the land acknowledgement piece that we had at the beginning. We don't hear that in this country, but it speaks to my work and it moved me quite a lot. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope this works. I've had disasters with it before, but let's see if we can do it. Hang on.
There should be a green button at the bottom of your screen.
I got it. Sorry, I'm being useless. Is that working? Is there?
No, it's still blank.
There, I think it's just coming.
Oh, there you go.
Is that up?
Yep.
Okay. So I've tweaked my title very slightly. Okay. This is what I talk about when I talk about walking. I hope this connection is going to. It's very interesting to do this because if anything, I'm humbled and I'm something of an anti-walker as well as being a walker. So I hope I can make that clear. I don't really talk about walking. I'm doing a PhD that was motivated by psychogeography. I don't have a walking practice. I do walk a lot as part of my research, but I've never been a fan of going out walking as others do. Walking for me is used to fulfill a very specific function. And I also use other modes of ambulation, such as cycling, which I've used extensively in my current research. That said, it turns out I do have a walking practice. Today I want to try and explain how being in the landscape combines with constructing a text from the landscape. I'm also going to read a short part of my text, which is my research by practice. When I walk, I do not obsess on the walkingness. I do not align myself with other walkers, but with the production of a text by moving within and outside the landscape. I choose specific pieces to be within, to walk within, or around, or across, or in and out of. I'm a site-specific walker. I walk to produce a text. The text is not necessarily a written piece, and a walk does not necessarily involve walking. I would say I have a being in the landscape practice, and I have an assembling the fragments practice, and probably others. I regard these as part and parcel of my creative practice or my art practice. I was originally an artist and spent a lot of time making large-scale site-specific installations in empty or abandoned buildings. My walking practice then is a site-specific practice. I only make work that relates to a place. I can't go for a walk for the pleasure of the walk, only as a way into a subject. Long before I knew about walking art, I was fascinated by maps and tracking devices, by constructions within places. I effectively fashioned my own early practice by planning walks on paper maps and by using GPS devices to track and plot walks. Many of these projects were more theoretical than practical. The walks themselves never undertaken. The creation of a plan often became the work. I'm interested in what the process of moving around within the field engenders. Walking is only one of the methods by which a field can be investigated. It is the substrate on which the investigation sits. Substrates are interchangeable. The result may differ by the substrate, but the intention and the product can be understood as a line. I've come to look at walking as one substrate of my practice. My current walking research then originated from a reading of the French Auschwitz survivor, Charlotte Delbo, and her descriptions of leaving the camp to work in the landscape. My current research considers the construction of a fresh text from a prolonged examination of a much considered landscape. My specific site is the zone of interest of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and my technique over the last 2.5 years has been to repeatedly visit and walk in this landscape, while at the same time examining extant texts and documentation, anything that sheds light on the place within the now rather than what happened before. This research expanded and contracted quickly from the well-known sites such as Auschwitz I and Birkenau to encompass the small town that gave its name to them, to the fields and landscapes around them, to the places in between, the interstices or soglia of Auschwitz. My trips have taken me on foot, on bicycle, in cars and trains across and through and under and over this landscape. I've mapped the zone extensively, layering modern and historic maps onto the literal landscape that Google gives us, each time returning to what had previously been an empty space to discover more remnants, more fragments to assemble. I used a variety of techniques for creating ways to move through the space, but largely I make palimpsests of layered maps and images, and of course, I write. When I started, there was me and the place, and all the texts about the place. I'd read Primo Levi, of course. Then I read Charlotte Delbo. Her telling of journeys out of the camp gave me a starting point regarding a geography of the place. Not a place constrained by fences, but a fluid texting place, flexing place, where inside and outside sometimes reversed, where the edges were not clear. I had the start of a geographic view of the site, but I had not walked across the lines, and until I did, everything meant nothing. As soon as I went to the site, everything changed, of course. Slowly, but that was the point. Before I set foot in the landscape, I had only my imagined landscape. I took inspiration from Deserto, two movements that intersect, a sort of crossword decoding stencil. I wanted to make a template for converting a place into a text, I wanted to be able to put my stencil down in different places and see what texts were generated. So I just wanted to briefly show you my map layering technique, which is the process that I use when I'm not in the field, and the process I use to examine, or one of the processes that I use to examine a landscape. Just this is this previous slide was Charlotte Delbo, and this is a map. This is a German map of Roscoe, where she worked outside Auschwitz-Birkenau, and it's one of the first places that I endeavoured to find in the landscape. Now I work with a tool called Scribble Maps, which allows me to layer multiple maps and images in the same place. And here, just to show you that from the previous slide, is a satellite view of the landscape underneath, and on top of it, a pre-war map showing Roscoe, which is just near Auschwitz-Birkenau, which is to the north of it, the edges of it you can see here. So I started collecting maps of Birkenau as it was my place, my subject, and it's mapped in so many different ways. This is satellite imagery of the contemporary site, and the tourist map, which attempts to guide you through the site, although the site is not really very addressable in that way, or in some ways it is very gridded. This is a UNESCO map of the Auschwitz I to the right here, and Birkenau to the left here, with the railway line running between them. And the yellow lines are UNESCO's quiet zone. Auschwitz-Birkenau is a UNESCO listed site. There's supposed to be no development around the site, but modern life is encroaching ever more on these sites. So this is UNESCO's attempt to hold back the tide. Not very successful, but this is my sort of working map process. To the left here, highlighted, you can see Birkenau. This to the right of it is highlighted is Auschwitz I, and over to the right is Monowitz, which was the third camp and is now the industrial park of Oschwestheim, which is, this is the old town here. This is a growing town. So we have a modern town and the sites around which surround it, and the relationship between these places. This is the river, obviously in blue, and the railway running here, north to south, north to south. This is the same map. This is always my view when I'm not in the landscape of the three sites. This is with a wartime aerial photograph underlaid, a wartime aerial photograph that was annotated actually after the war. Auschwitz and Birkenau were photographed because they wanted to bomb Monowitz, which was an industrial site over here. They weren't photographed deliberately, they were photographed accidentally. It's part of my process to find the fragments and the remnants. And this is my own annotation of an overlaid map. And this is effectively how I find things in the landscape to walk to examine. This is a pre-war map overlaid on the landscape, which we saw part of earlier, and you can see in it, and this is Birkenau camp here, and you can see in the image that the camp aligns itself with existing pre-war structures, paths. There's a path through the middle of the camp. There are boundaries It's not a new landscape. It's not a landscape that was invented from nothing. It was imposed on what was already there. And this leads me to find what I'm looking for to make the linkages. This is a close-up of the same space, Birkenau camp and the pre-war town, which has been reconstructed. So when I first went to the site, I noted a lot of things. And one of the things I noticed was this place here, which was right outside Birkenau camp, where all the tourists you can see to the left are coming from the bus station down this path and behind the photographer into the camp. I noticed the railway lines that came in and out of the camp disappeared into the undergrowth here. When I went home, I looked on Google satellite images, and I here, can you see my cursor? There's a curve in the landscape which you can see running here from left to right between the roads. I saw that in the Google satellite maps, and later I found it on this wartime map here to the left, this curve around here, and that's the remains of the railway, which is not publicly acknowledged in the site. When I returned to the site, I walked this abandoned railway where the tracks still exist, untouched, and very, very overgrown, although it seems to be a protected space. So my walking takes me into the landscape again and again. This is another site. This is a Birkenau again. In the 1950s, there was a competition to build a monument to Birkenau. One of the proposals was to seal the camp and to construct a raised granite slash across the center of the camp. The chairman of the competition was Henry Moore, and they chose this proposal, but it was rejected because sealing the camp was considered an impossibility. Sealing the camp and letting it crumble into dust was considered an impossibility. This is the proposal for the slash monument across the camp, overlaid onto the contemporary camp landscape. And again, I went to this place and I've walked, paced out this slash and measured it and marked it and photographed it as a sort of homage to something that should have been built but wasn't. And another thing I do is to overlay contemporary maps. So this is a proposal for a motorway to run around the outside of the town, but obviously the landscape is hugely significant. And this motorway, which is shown here, the various options of blue and yellow and red lines, they all run through Raceco, where Charlotte Delbo worked, and another place that I visit regularly. And another place that I've searched out is the railway crossing. So this photograph on the left is a funeral immediately after liberation of the camp, where a huge line of coffins was taken from Birkenau to Auschwitz I for burial. This overpass is demolished, but it seems that this on the right is the remnant of the overpass that we see on the left. Again, the landscape gives up its past only by being in the landscape, by interrogating it. And this is where the landscape is on my overlay map, here in the middle. So I quickly became something between a tourist and a prurient seeker after dark history, neither of which I wanted to be. This research theoretically entailed making a deep map of a difficult or dark place by undertaking psychogeographical processes. Research proceeded by the thought that walking at random around a site might generate that complex text. This research is preceded by the process of the accumulation of material regarding this location. Material fragments which must be reordered to produce a text. Although a place may be well known, be aware that there will be no simple or single name or explanation for it. Know what you want to examine closely, but be aware that it may not exist. Be aware that your idea of a foundation or touchstone may fall away. Aim to get so close that you can no longer look inward from the outside, but only outward from the inside. Get so close it is silent, there is nothing to look at. Connect the spatiality of this place to the external history of the place. Engage in a different way. That way is up to you. Traverse the site repeatedly. Engage, don't shy away. Engage with the way large and small events fit together to create a view of history. Find the disjointed parts of the place, assemble them in your mind, understand the relationship between fragments. The centre and the hinterland exist as a conjoined whole. Nothing is as simple as it looks from outside. It is a place with no obvious centre or edges. I went to the space of Auschwitz, a binary unit with subcamps, and although I knew it was a divided space, I thought of it as one place. It is clear now, though it was not at the start, that there are two categories of tools for looking at this place. Tools for examining the place as a totality and tools for dividing the place into parts. You can only go to Auschwitz for the first time once. When I walked out from my hotel, I had no idea what was hiding from me in plain view in the landscape. I didn't know anything. I didn't know that my hotel, the Polin, carried the Yiddish name for Poland. I didn't know that behind my hotel, below my balcony, were the remains of Jew Street, where the biggest synagogue had been until destroyed by the Nazis. I didn't understand that the huge new hotel that stretched from the riverside to the top of the hill was built on the site of a Jewish business. All I knew was that I could walk from here to the remains of the camp known as Auschwitz. I had a plan to walk through town, cross the railway lines and on towards Birkenau. I didn't think much about what I was going to encounter. I thought a lifetime of pictures and books had prepared me. I was looking for what I knew was there. The large camp at Ruzlinka is almost due west from the old town square where I was staying. My hotel overlooked the Rheineck, the town square, at the front, and although I didn't know it, the site of the old Grand Synagogue and Jew Street at the back. I spent some time gazing from my balcony down towards the river, the Sola, and at the huge new hotel that climbed up from the bank across the road into town. There are many things I don't know and no simple way of learning them. There are the unknown unknown. These are the unknown unknowns. I don't know how many ways there are to cross the river. I head down to the road bridge that spans the Sola in front of the hotel. I don't know that the hotel replaced the Haberfeld house and factory. I don't know that the Haberfelds were Jewish. I set out to walk to Birkenau. There are several possible routes and my approach is random. I do know the rough direction. I cross the river and cut through Zasoli, the new town on the west bank of the river. What I'm hoping is that whatever route I take will throw up remnants of the past, fragments of buildings, sites, roads, signs, the detritus of development. I'm searching for my palimpsest on the ground. I can retrace my route that day by looking at the photos I took, each of which is timed and geolocated within the automatic archive that these devices create. I was writing by walking, although I didn't take much notice of how that would work, what the structure would be. I took my first image at 9:02 and then one at 9:07 outside the youth centre. I later emerged opposite the station and took a left on the Krakow road that runs parallel to the tracks. After that, I didn't take anything more until I reached the overpass that takes the road to Birkenau over the main road on the PKP railway line. The huge Soviet railway station did not have much time left in this world. By the following year, it's been demolished, and a new, smaller and more modern station was being built to go with the modernisation and electrification of the Czernów-Krakow line. The line from Katowice and to the Czech Republic meet here. 3 rivers, 3 rail lines. The road crossing between Auschwitz I and Birkenau has clearly been rebuilt since the war. There are the remains of a previous bridge emerging from the undergrowth on the west side. The bridge crosses from the Zasol district towards Auschwitz to Birkenau, but no signs point this way on the main road. I didn't think much about where I was or what else was in the landscape, but I quivered with anticipation of seeing the camp appear ahead of me. Although everyone knows the image of the gatehouse, I can't say I had a picture in my head of what I was going to see. I knew that I was walking into the past, slouching towards the abyss, and at this time there was no distance between me and it. St. Augustine said, "The dead may be invisible, but they are not absent." And then the gatehouse the next year had disappeared. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ivan. That was super interesting. I've got some notes here for the discussion afterwards. So lots of food for thought here. Now, on to the next presenters. Green and Owens are Kathryn Owens and Chris Green, currently undertaking a co-authored collaborative practice research PhD in performance studies at the University of Plymouth. Their research is focused on the performance of millennial precarity, drawing on their everyday experiences of labor, housing, money. This is explored through their practice of performance writing, which often takes the form of zines, craft, sound recordings, DIY aesthetics, and walking. They are interested in the concept of hauntology and how this relates to myth and placemaking. Their work has been published in Performance Research and Studies in Theatre and Performance, and they have also presented at a number of international conferences. They both currently work as part-time lecturers in performance at Leeds Beckett University, as well as working in hospitality in order to keep themselves alive. Green and Owens.
Thanks. We just wanted to say thank you so much to Ken for inviting us, and that we're really happy to be presenting our work with everybody on this panel today.
I'm just going to try and share my screen, so bear with me one moment. Can everybody see? I'm using a really old version of PowerPoint, but can everybody see my screen? Yeah, okay, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so let me just get myself settled, sorry. So we are Kathryn Owens and Chris Green, and we're nearing the end of our Practices Research PhD project, which is conducted entirely collaboratively. We're friends. We met in 2011 during our masters. And when we began our PhD, we were interested in collaboration as a more like genuine reflection of knowledge production, or what for us felt like a more genuine reflection of knowledge production. And we were interested in the imagination and interpretation, but we hadn't really established what we meant by this yet. And as the end draws nearer, friendship has remained central to our approach throughout. And we're currently thinking about how friendship offers an alternative to a heteronormative neoliberal interpretation of care. And as you just heard in our bio, our research is focused on the performance of millennial precarity, drawing on our everyday experiences, in particular of housing, money and labour. And this is explored through a practice of performance writing that utilises zines, craft, sound recordings, DIY aesthetics, and walking. And we're interested in the concept of hauntology and how this relates to myth and placemaking. Hauntology, oh, sorry, just change the slide. Hauntology brings together both ontology, the study of being, and haunting, the not quite dead, in order to consider and question those things that might have been or may never be. And we're particularly drawn to Mark Fisher's writing on this in relation to precarity. We use hauntology as a means to discuss a sense of failure of the imagination in relation to precarity, a sense of trappedness and of a lost future. And we use performance writing as a means of accessing the imagination in an attempt to overcome this stuckness. Walking's often a part of that process of devising, of thinking time, a way of being with friends, or a way of thinking about our location.
So, Chapel Street is one of a number of streets which join the city of Salford to the city of Manchester. Most of the times that we've been to Chapel Street, it has been from the direction of Manchester. When you walk from Manchester to Salford, if you didn't know you were leaving one city to enter another, you might think you were still in Manchester due to the proximity of the two. However, they do feel different. You leave one of the central areas of Manchester, a shopping district with bars and venues popular with footballers, walk down another road, and are suddenly in an area that looks and feels different, something that sits between old and new.
I've just noticed a typo there on Salford border. Never mind. Chapel Street is long with only a couple of bends. It's relatively wide, it hugs the River Irwell, and it has a mixture of residential buildings, pubs, and a number of culturally significant sites along the way. These include a gallery and museum, the site of which was once the first free public library in the UK, an abandoned pub where Marx and Engels are said to have drunk, that's the pub on the screen right now, the Working Class Movement Library, and a shop that sits between bulldozed buildings because the proprietor is protesting his business being knocked down in the name of regeneration and redevelopment. And actually, since we made the work we're talking about, the shop has been knocked down. The arts building of the University of Salford as well, and a meadow. In 2020, we had the loose plan to produce a series of performance scores that offered readers a way of exploring the area, a way of walking in the area, and a way of thinking about location. We planned this initially in response to a call out for performance works to take place as part of an arts festival called Loiter. Our proposal was not successful, but we decided to make the work anyway because we'd begun to wonder about why Chapel Street resonated with us. Our interest in Chapel Street differs from the subjects of our other works. So whereas in past we've made works about our specific experience, the difference with Chapel Street is it's somewhere we visit and it's somewhere we have a fondness for, and we have memories of being there, and we have a vague awareness of the history of the area, but we don't live there and we don't work there. And we're not from there, and we're not part of the community. And the specifics of what goes on in Chapel Street has no bearing on our daily lives. However, through making an artwork about Chapel Street, we discovered that it is a hauntological site, and the history, present, and future of this area mirrors what is happening at other locations across the UK.
We initially approached this project by walking up and down Chapel Street and stopping at locations that we felt connected to. This was for a variety of reasons, primarily to do with our affective relationship with each location. Some locations we are familiar with because of stories we have been told when walking with the Manchester-based Derive group, the Loiterers Resistant Movement, which is a collective of people who go on monthly wanders through the city, organised by the artist Morag Rose. For example, where people have shared their memories of locations or have mentioned local narratives about the place. Some of the connections we felt are because of memories of times we have been to Chapel Street before, in particular to specific pubs and the university buildings. We utilised some of our anecdotal memories in the artwork we have made. We then drafted performance scores about our chosen sites. The scores are loose instructions for the reader, such as, imagine your ideal window, or what will you keep forever, why? Some of the scores read initially as more open than others. For example, count the blades of grass in an empty field suggests a meditation exercise or thinking exercise, or perhaps is resonant of Marina Abramovic's training method, such as the cleaning the house workshop that encourages ways of being present. Other scores are more suggestive, such as what matters so much that you'll make it your last stand. Presented as a question, for us these more leading scores are less meditative or thoughtful with regards to thinking about one's presence in the surroundings, and is more about recognizing the impact of the changing landscape, or at the very least noticing the changing landscape. Other scores are more specific as to a circumstance, such as buy a friend a drink, and invite reflection on the connection between one's relationship and the environment, such as through how the street may make the reader recall memories of being with particular people. We suggest that these are potential ways the scores may be read, or perhaps more accurately, are some of the ways we have read the scores.
We also did some light reading about the history of each chosen site, and although we're not concerned with making a history walk out of the project, we did end up making an audio tour that incorporated unverified historical information that we liked. We realised whilst making this audio element, as well as on repeated visits walking up and down the road, that part of what drew us to Chapel Street was a myth. In particular, the myth that we mentioned previously, that Marx and Engels drank on Chapel Street. We cannot remember where we first heard this story, but we enjoy this rumour enough to explore the connection more. Ultimately, whether apocryphal or not, Marx and Engels now haunt our interpretation of Chapel Street.
As mentioned previously, the work comprises 13 business card size printed scores. Each one is different. These cards are presented inside a black cardboard box that looks like a small jewellery box. There is also a pamphlet with information about how to use the artwork. The pamphlet includes a QR code that readers can scan to access the audio component. There is also a map drawn on tracing paper that labels each location in correspondence to the audio tour that can be placed over other maps as a way to transpose the route to other locations.
The work has similarities with that of Rights and Sites Myth Guides and may potentially be likened to a mythogeographical exploration of the street as articulated by Phil Smith. To quote, mythogeography has developed as a paranoid, exploratory, detective-like approach to space and place, deploying Tim Ingold's model of hermetic-like excavation of ever finer layers of geographical texture. It has prioritized anomalies and in-betweenness, working in gaps, extolling voids, and constructing general ideas from the and of the accumulation and assemblage of disparate parts, see Deleuze and Guattari, end quote. As such, each element of the artwork could be said to be adding a layer further to the geography of the street. We think of the audio component as ghostly. For other tourists, and we'll return to this notion of being a tourist in a moment, perhaps those who in particular do not know Chapel Street or are listening at other sites, the listener's encounter with the area is filtered through our own voices. We position this as writerly, using Barth's description of how semiotic codes are used in such a way that meaning is not narratively easy. Where audiences have no tangible connection to Chapel Street, particularly if listening in other locations, the audience must make their own connections to the audio, in effect, completing their version of the narrative. The idea of the ghostly here is one of suggestion, of being haunted by our experience of Chapel Street, but not being defined by this.
Chapel Street's unique history encompasses left-wing and union movements and is inherently connected to the working class history of the area. For example, Peel Park is one of the first public parks in the UK, formed so that the local working class would have access to green space. However, this history now haunts the area as it has become a regeneration project, and there is a sense that its working class history and the present of that working classness is being removed. This is something we recognise from other locations we've visited and cities that we have lived in, such as Ancoats in Manchester and the Haygate Estate in Elephant and Castle in London. We found that whilst the specifics of individual locations will differ from area to area, the street as a whole is recognisable across the UK as a regeneration project, somewhere in a state of change by the contemporary neoliberal agenda. Chapel Street is home, for example, to the Islington estate, and we found when reading in the MEN, which is a local newspaper, about the regeneration of Chapel Street, that there was concerns that this was not for the local community on this estate. The concern is that the project is to bring in new residents into new build houses and flats that the current residents cannot afford, and to provide amenities to accompany these new residences that, again, the current local residents cannot afford. As part of this process, older businesses that serve the local community are being forced to shut and are knocked down, as with the shop that we mentioned earlier. And there is concern that the social housing and ex-social housing flats could be next. Whether this sense of what might happen does actually come to pass or not, the narrative is familiar. Both the aspect of concern from the local community and the projects that oversee the building of new residences, creating uncannily similar building sites across the UK cities.
Streets that are in the process of regeneration are hauntological because of the ghost of the past, the nostalgia accompanying this, and the projection of imagined future residents. Chapel Street, to quote Derrida, or to borrow from Derrida, lingers in this transitory passage between the past and an uncertain future. There is the potential experience of precarity for the local residents and the uncertainty of building for a future that hasn't happened yet. There is also the sense that the regeneration project isn't building for the future at all, or at least not for a future that serves most people, but rather is a way to create neoliberal growth, bringing in the consequent precarity that this ensures. We find Jen Harvey's definition of neoliberal useful here, where neoliberalism is the revived form of liberalism which thrived first in Britain in the 17th century, and which recognises and prioritises the individual's right to seek self-fulfilment, and to do so in conditions unrestricted by state-initiated regulations, such as requirements to pay appropriate taxes, to heed trade restrictions, or to observe employment laws pertaining to hiring, firing, and paying workers. In neoliberal capitalism, these principles of diminishing state intervention and enhanced individual liberty to seek self-reward work in the service of maximising private profit.
In the previous works that we've made for this PhD research, we've reflected very much on our personal circumstances. For example, we drew on our own house, our own workplaces, and our own feelings about these experiences. The difference in making work about and on Chapel Street is that we do not inhabit the site in the same way. Whilst we do draw on our relationship to Chapel Street, a lot of what we have concluded about it as a hauntological site sits outside of our relationship to Chapel Street specifically. For example, when we make reference to how regeneration can lead to precarity for residents, we are aware that this is not our experience there, as we are not those residents. Secondly, this is not a socially engaged practice, and so we want to be mindful that we are not trying to represent an experience that we have not researched or represent people who we have no relationship with. We don't have the authority to do that, and we are mindful we are reflecting on a place that residents don't have this tourist relationship with, because for them, this is home. We are essentially tourists in this site. And as such, our understanding of Chapel Street as tourists comes from how we recognise the impact of the neoliberal on Chapel Street, whilst being limited to drawing on our experiences of that. Whilst the process in our Chapel Street work is different to the previous works, the outcome, as in the practice that we've actually finalised and made, is familiar.
Our relationship to this work and the location problematises our position when writing about precarity. With regards to housing and labour, it's often felt quite straightforward that the models available to us don't work for us, but we are yet to imagine an alternative model. And in that instance, when we say we mean literally the two of us. When it comes to pockets of the city that resonate with us culturally, but that are undergoing change that impacts on the local community, we're now wondering how we might be contributing to other people's precarity by consuming the things put in place as part of the regeneration project. And I guess I would just add there as an aside that regeneration itself doesn't inherently have to be a negative thing, but in this instance, we're talking about the impact on the local community and how the regeneration project doesn't take them into account. Sorry, I just lost my place. We are now wondering how we might be contributing to other people's precarity by consuming the things put in place as part of the regeneration project. We've not really remained as residents in a location long enough to understand the impact of being threatened out of our long-term homes by rising costs, although we've had to move many times because of rents rising in the areas that we've lived in. Furthermore, it's likely that even when we're drawn to these gentrified sites, we'll remain tourists in them and not reside as them, as we are pricing ourselves out of the market to live there and contributing to a rise in prices through consuming the goods available. In writing up our reflections on the process of making this work, we're thinking more about the role of what the role of art making might be in problematizing these structures.
And just to close up, just wanted to give some reflections on collaboration. So we think of all of our work for this project as collaborative. We include in this the people who interact with the work, and we haven't really gone into too much detail about that here, but our approach is informed by Bart's, particularly with the concept of the writerly and how that relates to reading and writing. In both the practice and the thesis, we would find it hard to separate whose voice is whose, and there isn't any sense of ownership over the work, i.e. that an idea comes from one person or the other. And just to say that collaborative PhDs are really rare in the UK, and we were kind of really only able to do that at Plymouth because there was already a precedent set of collaborative PhDs happening through our supervisor, Lee Miller, who did the first collaborative performance PhD in the UK with Bob Whaley, and also our other supervisor, Professor Roberta Mock, being the head of the doctoral college and being able to kind of frame how we might do that and kind of come up with the regulations around that, and was also really, really supportive of that. As far as we're aware, there is one other completed collaborative arts-based PhD outside of the Lee and Bob's, and that was with Pilangalia Collective at Goldsmiths University in London. And at the moment, there is also another collaborative PhD happening at Plymouth University between Terry and James Harper Bailey. As far as we're aware, all of the collaborative PhDs have kind of been between married couples, and ours is kind of the first one that's been done between two friends. Yeah, so yeah, that's the end.
We were just asked to talk a bit on the process of doing a collaborative PhD, but I guess we haven't really reflected on that much here. But yeah, so we can talk more about that if people are interested, but the logistics of it is what Chris just explained. Anyway, thank you.
And the last image here is of the QR code, so if anybody wanted to kind of link up to that and get access to the sound recording and perform their own work using that sound recording, then please feel free to do so.
Thank you so much, Chris and Kathryn. That was a really excellent presentation on actually what you're doing is expanded collaboration. So brilliant. Thank you very much. And we look forward to the discussion afterwards. So our fourth presenter is Ken Wilson. Ken is a PhD candidate in media and artistic research in the Faculty of Media, Art and Performance at the University of Regina. He has published articles on his walking art practice in the International Journal of Religious Tourism and Pilgrimage and Canadian Theatre Review, and has articles forthcoming in Performance Matters and Studies in Canadian Literature. He also contributed a chapter to the book Walking Bodies, Papers, Provocations, Actions, edited by Phil Smith, Helen Billinghurst, and Claire Hind, published in 2020. One thing that Ken does not have here in his bio is that he was also a contributor to the 2015 volume, The Directory of World Cinema Africa. Brilliant reviews in there. It's not in his bio, Ken. But now Ken is working on a creative nonfiction manuscript about his investigation of the Regina bypass, and he has a website link that we can visit. So Ken, over to you.
Thank you, Sheila. Yes, I should have put the Dictionary of World Cinema in my bio. You're right. I'm going to share my screen because I have a photo essay of sorts that is going to run under my presentation. So I am hoping and of course, there we go. I turned south on Pinky Road. The walking is a little easier now that I'm not heading into the wind, but gusts are shoving me towards the edge of the shoulder, and I'm leaning sideways against them. Someone has dumped a bushel of corn mixed with fertilizer beside the road, and a blue plastic storage bin has blown into the ditch. When Pinky approaches Center Road, it arcs west, and I find myself walking into the wind again. On the overpass that carries Center Road over the bypass, the wind pulls at my glasses. It wants to tear them away and throw them into the highway below. I'm bent double now, like a wing walker in a barnstorming show. I had intended to walk all the way to Fleming Road and then north to take a look at the Canadian Pacific Intermodal Yard across the main railway line. But I decide I'm not going to walk into the wind any longer than I have to and turn south on the first township road after the overpass towards Highway 1. The road is a gravel berm laid across the landscape, flat and straight. In a momentary lull in the wind, I hear a meadowlark singing. The wind is tiring, and I start singing to keep up my spirits, surprising two gray partridges which scuttle into the air complaining. A truck passes, and I exchange a wave with its driver. I sit in the grass beside the road to rest for a minute. The city fills the horizon, the glass towers of the downtown, the green copper dome of the legislature, the taller buildings at the university. In the middle distance, trucks move along the Regina bypass. A field of stubble glows in the foreground. I stand and continue walking, passing the right-of-way of the Keystone Pipeline and startling a jackrabbit. When I started my PhD program, using walking as a way to research the Regina bypass and the global transportation hub, the warehouse park west of the city that the bypass was intended to service, was the last thing on my mind. I had intended to make a long walk across Treaty 4 territory from the Cypress Hills to Fort Qu'Appelle as a way to think about that treaty and its meaning, and to consider whether such a long walk might bring me into a relationship with the land. After all, I would be experiencing the land for at least a month, its contours and flatness, the sky, and maybe, unless we were having another dry year, the rain, sleeping on the ground, plodding along highways and grid roads, stopping in towns for food and water, and occasionally a bed. But the pandemic put an end to that idea. It was just barely possible before the pandemic. Rural Saskatchewan is a difficult place to walk at the best of times. But when hotels, restaurants, and stores closed because of COVID-19, I realized that the community support such a walk was going to need simply wouldn't be there. I wasn't sure what to do instead. And when the University of Regina offered students the chance to take a year away from their studies because of the pandemic without any academic penalty, I took it. One day, early in that pandemic spring, I walked to the Regina Indian Industrial School Cemetery on Pinky Road. I try to make that walk at least once a year. It's a way to make sure I don't forget the children buried there, what they and the others who survived that horrible place and others like it experienced. I remember it was a windy day as usual. I put down tobacco and looked at the new fence built by volunteers around the site. Then I sat down and drank some water. In the distance, I could see trucks gliding silently over the Regina bypass. I didn't know much about the bypass except that it was controversial, that it was somehow connected to the global transportation hub, that there were scandals over the way public money was used to acquire the land. But I'd never driven on the bypass, nor had I been to the GTH. Sitting on the grass next to the new fence that afternoon, I decided to spend the summer learning more and to use walking as my primary methodology in that research. That decision led to a series of walks in and around Regina, during which I took photographs and notes of what I saw, heard, smelled, and otherwise experienced. I walked out to the bypass in each cardinal direction: west, east, north, and south. I walked to the GTH, observing the huge weed-filled lots, the roads that go nowhere, the intermodal terminal that looks temporary, as if the Canadian Pacific could pull up stakes tomorrow and move on. And finally, in early September, I walked around the bypass itself, a 3-day journey. These private walking performances have been documented in a book-length creative nonfiction manuscript that is influenced by William Least Heat Moon's deep mapping, Nick Papadimitrio's deep topography, and Ian Sinclair's study of the M25 motorway around London. I guess that last one goes without saying, in which I juxtaposed descriptions of those walks against memoir and reflections on the ongoing history of settler occupation of the land, as represented by the highway, with its massive overpasses and the borrow pits it left behind, and the warehouse park, along with the farmland which surrounds everything here. This walking and writing project asked several questions, as such research creation projects typically do. One has to do with anthropologist Marc Auger's distinction between places and non-places. Unlike anthropological places, a non-place excludes the possibilities of the journeys, the possibility of the journeys made in it, the discourses uttered in it, and the language characterizing it, Auger writes. Places are about the possibility of stories about human action. Non-places, on the other hand, are spaces of spectatorship, of looking rather than doing, the spaces of tourists who pay little attention to the spectacle they came to see. The non-places of supermodernity are defined partly by the words and texts they offer us, according to Auger, prescriptive, prohibitive, or informative texts that are sometimes communicated through ideograms and other times in ordinary language. In non-places, individuals are expected to interact only with these signs, whose authors are not individuals, but institutions, like the Provincial Ministry of Highways or the private corporation managing the global transportation hub. Non-places are sites through which one passes, not places of engagement or experience. So when I walk in or write about or photograph such sites, I'm interacting with or documenting these non-places. But I also wondered whether the act of walking and writing and photographing could make an impoverished, even abject non-place like the shoulder of a highway into place again. And that question led to other, more profound questions. Could walking, even on a grid road or highway, be a way to enter into a relationship with the land, or perhaps to recognize that such a relationship already exists? What might coming into that kind of relationship mean in a place where the land is typically considered an object that is available for extractive economic purposes, for industrial agriculture, for gravel pits and oil wells, and a highway, as you see in this picture, rather than a subject, something that is alive and agential, our kin? Now, for people who haven't experienced walking in Saskatchewan, which is many of you, I need to explain something about access to land for pedestrians here. There is very little. Our provincial trespassing law is designed to keep people off private land. It requires the permission of landowners before one can step onto private land, and almost all the land hereabouts is private. And that is difficult to do since nothing identifies who actually owns the land except rural municipality maps, which go out of date as land is bought and sold. There's no notion of any right of responsible access, no municipal footpaths that farmers and ranchers are required to tolerate crossing their property. Walkers are, with few exceptions, restricted to public roads. No wonder nobody walks in rural Saskatchewan. As my walking friend, the pilgrimage scholar, Dr. Matthew Anderson, I think he's with us today, has observed, if you're walking in rural Saskatchewan, anyone who sees you will assume your vehicle is broken down. It would be easier to think about relating to the land while walking across a patch of native grassland, or a piece of aspen forest that hasn't yet been plowed under or cut down. But with a few exceptions, that experience isn't available near the city where I live. The notion of relationship with the land from the shoulder of the highway or at the edge of a grid road, the idea of being connected to the neighboring fields of wheat and canola is quixotic, even mad. But for several years now, I've wondered if it might be possible. And relating to the land as kin is far more intimate and potentially transformational than the idea of turning place into non-place. I've become certain that walking can turn non-places into places, but I also know that walking myself into a relationship with the land is potentially much more difficult. These questions about place and relationship to land are complicated perhaps by the fact that the pandemic and the potential danger of walking on busy roads around the city meant that I had to walk alone. Once the pandemic began, my university stopped accepting ethics board applications for research with human subjects as fellow walkers would be considered in the context of this project. And I doubt that any project that asked people to walk 12 or 20 kilometers on roads without a support vehicle following, carrying food and water, and those who'd gotten tired of the journey would have been approved even without the pandemic. And I had no budget to rent a van or hire a driver. At the same time, I know that solo durational walking practices are considered passé these days, even politically suspect. In their important essay, for instance, Walking Women, Shifting the Tails and Scales of Mobility, Deirdre Hedden and Kathy Turner disparaged that kind of walking as, quote, individualist, heroic, epic, and transgressive, unquote, not to mention masculinist. Phil Smith, in his book, Walking's New Movement, suggests that the heroic solo art walk, which is inaccessible to most people due to its epic proportions, is being replaced by walking performances that are more sociable and democratic, even if those are not yet necessarily transformational. The projects that are discussed at conferences on walking art tend to be relational, dialogic, social, or convivial. Given the pandemic, though, along with what was involved in using walking to research the Regina bypass and the global transportation hub, I couldn't see any way to proceed except by walking alone. However, a Nehio or Cree elder I know, a poet and a fellow walker, we met on a participatory convivial walk between Mortlach and Gravelbourg, Saskatchewan, and again on another walk from Humboldt, Saskatchewan to Fort Carlton, both of which were organized by Swift Current Saskatchewan artist and historian Hugh Henry, who I think is with us today as well. She advised me as we trudged down a graveled grid road that when I'm walking on the land, I'm never really alone. I'm with the land. I'm coming into a relationship with it. Even if the grassland has been plowed under, even if you're walking past canola fields, she said, you can still feel the sun on your face, see the sky, hear the birds, sense the gentle contours of the land with the muscles in your legs because, contrary to popular belief, the prairie is never completely flat. You're not alone when you're walking by yourself, she said. You're with the land. It is with you. Her words have stayed with me. They remind me of Stephanie Springay and Sarah E. Truman's notion of walking with. Walking with, they write, should not be misunderstood as only connoting conviviality and sociability or the idea that you have to walk with a group of people. You could do it alone. They suggest that what is essential to walking with is an explicit acknowledgement of political positions and situated knowledges which reveal our entanglements with settler colonization and neoliberalism. Walking with demands that we forgo universal claims about how humans and non-humans experience walking and consider more than human ethics and politics of the material intra-actions of walking research, they continue. The idea of walking with certainly might suggest walking with other people, and indeed the walking projects Springay and Truman describe in their book do tend to work that way. But if my walking friend, the Nehio elder, is correct, then when I'm walking on the land, even when I'm walking on a grid road, I'm also walking with the land. Another Nehio writer and walker, Dwayne Donald, agrees that walking, even on grid roads, is a way to come into relationship with the land. In his essay, We Need a New Story, Walking in the Wahkotowan Imagination, Donald notes that he is inspired by the Nehio concept of Wahkotowan, which refers to enmeshment within kinship relations that connect all forms of life. the kinds of relationships that are denied and erased by legacies of settler colonialism. When human beings undertake walking as a life practice, the Wokotowin imagination can be activated, wherein the networks of human and more than human relations that enmesh us become vivified and apparent, Donald writes. From this confluence of walking and the Wokotowin imagination emerges the possibility of a new story that can give good guidance on how to live life in accordance with kinship relationality. Walking, Donald contends, brings both settlers and Indigenous people into relationship with the land. Quote, by walking and listening, people begin to perceive the life around themselves differently. They feel enmeshed in relationships. This change in perception is not the result of anything special I do as their guide. Rather, it arises from their willingness to be put in the flow of the traditional wisdom insight of the Wokotowin imagination. They walk themselves into kinship relationality. Seeing the land as kin, that's what I hope will be the end result of my walking around Saskatchewan. I'm not sure I've arrived at that result yet, but I do feel differently about the land and about my presence here. It's almost as if, as Métis artist David Garneau has suggested, I'm starting to find a way, quote, to home in these territories without trying to settle them. But even that claim is politically difficult to make, given the vast literature that describes the differences between the ways settlers and Indigenous peoples think about and experience the land. And some might even suggest that making such a claim is a form of appropriation. Anangan education scholar Eve Tuck and her co-writer Kay Wen Yang, for instance, would likely consider my efforts at coming into kinship with the land by walking on it, quote, something like trying to make the settler Indigenous to the land he occupies, unquote, which they consider a settler colonial erasure of Indigenous peoples. And I accept that critique. My project may be quite literally an overstepping. And yet at the same time, I feel obliged to find some justification for my presence here in Saskatchewan, one that goes beyond the racism of terra nullius and the doctrine of discovery, one that replaces the colonial understanding of Treaty 4 as a transfer of land title from the Cree and Saulteaux and Nakota peoples to the Crown with another rooted in the Indigenous understanding of that treaty as an agreement to share the land. Coming into a relationship with the land might be a first step towards those goals, not only a step away from our extractive exploitation of the land, but also a step towards seeing the land as kin, as something that cannot or should not be bought and sold, but only shared. In other words, as Tuck and Marcia McKenzie suggest, it could herald a shift from a place-based paradigm that says something like, I am, therefore place is, to a land-based paradigm that says land is, therefore we are. That paradigm shift is where I hope my walking practice leads. Now, it might not. I accept the very real possibility of its failure. But in my walking research of the Regina bypass and the global transportation hub, I see glimmerings of its potential success. At least, I feel more connected to the land than I did when I started, and I'm beginning to understand it in a different way, as a relation rather than a thing. That shift, as tentative and internal and unmeasurable as it might be, gives me some hope that I've been walking in the right direction. Thanks. And I beat my, I managed to read faster than I thought, so my slides are still showing. I'll just stop sharing the screen.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ken. Yeah, you're just slightly under your time. So that was very inspirational. Thank you. All four presentations were excellent, and there are at least 4 themes or threads running through. So story, landscape, place, identity. These are all issues that I think we will want to take up in the discussion. And so I'm going to throw it open, and I'm going to try and direct traffic as much as possible. Perhaps people could put up their hands when they wish to ask a question or speak, and I will try to keep track of everything here. Who would like to kick this off? Ken, you have your hand up.
I do. I wanted to ask Ivan and Kathryn and Chris about the notion of tourism, because both of you talked about tourism and the feeling of being tourists. And in some ways, when I'm walking. I mean, I don't live at the global I mean, no one lives at the global transportation hub. I mean, that would be a silly place to live. But the idea of being in a place but not being of that place, and how one manages the fallout from that. I just wonder if you guys have anything to say about that, or any thoughts.
Well, I'll take a punt at it first. I am I really wanted to go to the site that I'm currently investigating as something different, but I don't know if that's possible. So it's always a conflict. I've been sort of told off for being slightly for assuming what the motives of other visitors are, or for sort of you know, not allowing them a big space. And this is a very difficult space that I'm talking about, so not that simple seaside or something here. So I struggle not to be a tourist, but also I try to appreciate being a tourist at the same time. I think tourism has a place to pay, and I think maybe we could take some steps back and examine what tourism is in that.
Sorry, I can't tell if your sound has gone, or if I'm about to speak over you, or if it's okay to speak.
Speak.
Okay, sorry. I just wanted to check. I think for us, this might sound like quite wishy-washy, but I think for us, like, part of addressing that feeling, or addressing like the complexities or the potential fallout from being a tourist is trying to pay attention to it and being careful with it and being mindful of it, and also being really open to being told that we've got something wrong and to take on like a constructive criticism about that. And I think that that's something that we've had to be mindful throughout the research project, because we're writing about this idea of millennial precarity, and obviously we're writing about that from a particular position, which is already a very privileged position. So I think this idea of not wanting to speak for others and trying to be mindful of how we address that is already kind of something we're trying to constantly do anyway. So I would say it's not that dissimilar in how we address the fallout of being a tourist. But then also the flip side of that, like Ivan just mentioned, the potential of being a tourist is that we also like really enjoy being a tourist too, and like we really enjoy, using Chapel Street as an example, we really enjoy being there, and we have like lots of great memories of being there. So I guess it's also just being mindful of like our role within that. Yeah. Thank you.
If I can just add quickly, that makes me think I also have a feeling that I'm a tourist in the space of the sort of Holocaust research, which is a space that I butt up against and try to penetrate and use quite a lot, but which I'm not taken seriously in whatsoever, because I don't adhere to the norms of that space. So it's like being a tourist who's doing something different or wrong, which is what I do in most places that I go to, whether it's a literal space or an academic space or any other sort of space. I'm always sort of slightly ajar from it.
Well, thank you very much. I see that Phil Smith is back in, and I'm wondering if he wants to say something. And Chris, if you want to join in also. So Chris and Phil, very quickly before we move to a question by Kathryn Ricketts.
Okay, well, very quickly on tourism. I mean, there was almost an orthodoxy in the 60s and through parts of the 70s, which was coming essentially from a sort of Marxian analysis, which was that the tourist was essentially the dupe of the tourist industry, And then academics started to actually go on holiday with tourists, actually started to, began a method of participant observation, and began to see how tourists as individuals or in small groups began to subvert what the industries were trying to do with and to them. And so I think there's always this contradiction in the role of the tourist. So I don't think, Ivan, you're the only tourist who misbehaves. I think the actually part and parcel of the way that lots of tourists
Okay, Phil, I think you've dropped out a bit again. Maybe, Chris, did you have anything to add before we move on to Kathryn Brachtt's question?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking about actually back in relation to stuff that you were talking about, Ken, to do with the idea of places and non-places. I'm wondering about kind of the role of the tourist in connection to that as well, and kind of where the tourist would exist in relation to a non-space, and how those spaces are different to places that are practice spaces, and like what that relationship would be between all those different things. Just got me thinking about that, and kind of how those different spaces, so a site that is kind of protected by UNESCO versus a street that's kind of where there's got a history of working class movement and people reside there, and is a active street that kind of isn't got those protections on there, versus a non-place, and kind of what the relationship between a tourist would be in all those different places, and what that would kind of look like or be. It's kind of not really an answer, but more of like a continuation of the question, I guess, and just me kind of thinking through those things and making connections.
Thanks very much, Chris. Now we've got 4 people with questions. So the lineup is Kathryn Brachtt is next, then we have Christine Ramsey, then we have Carol Schick, and then we have Whitney Blaisdell. So Kathryn, go ahead.
Great, thanks, Sheila. Phil, just before I ask the question, I love your carrots on the wall. They're quite fascinating. This is mainly for Ken, because I'm sorry, I was teaching prior, so I couldn't see the other presentations. I'm sure they were wonderful, and I'll see the recording. But Ken, I want to talk a little bit about your the juxtapositioning of your images with your text. And I was very compelled by the images. As you know, I love to take images that are sort of unpredictable capture of objects in place. And most of your images had a tension between the subject and the place, or the objects in relation to place. So I'm just wondering, on a general question, if you could talk about that and how that reflects the text that you were reading, and then more specifically, how does the image while you're walking, how does it allure you? Are you looking for those images? Do they call forward to you? Do you have your camera poised in your hand? So, 2 sort of questions, one more general and one more specific.
I think to answer the first question, there wasn't any specific relationship between the text and the images. The images were, as you saw, on a timer. And so I was hoping that there would be happy accidents. And I think there were. I noticed some as I was reading. Your second question, yeah, wow, for these walks, I carried a camera slung around my neck so that I didn't have to stop and dig it out. And anytime, yes, that something spoke to me or called to me, I would take a picture of it. The difficulty, as you know, in rural Saskatchewan is that there often is it's all ground and no figure, right? There's nothing there in the foreground. There's just this space of field of barley stubble, or maybe there's a sign in front, or maybe there's, I get lucky and there's a bird, and the bird is close enough that my camera can actually recognize it as a bird. But it strikes me that it's part of like trying to say, here's a landscape that most people would just simply drive through or try to ignore. but there are things here, and there are things worth attending to. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's refreshing about it is that often when people are walking in relation to self and place, they're drawn to a certain kind of majestic beauty of the land, you know, cliffs and greenery and crashing oceans like the coastline of the UK or whatever. And so I was very intrigued by that, what you're talking about, drawing closer attention to something that's much smaller and not necessarily deemed beauty in the traditional way.
And those things are here, but not necessarily within a 12-kilometer walk of the house where I live. You have to sort of go and seek them out, partly because so much of the land has been converted to industrial agriculture, which is not always an aesthetic practice.
Thanks, Ken.
Okay, thank you very much. I will reiterate our list. Next will be Christine Ramsey, then Carol Schick, then Whitney Bladell, and then Kathleen Irwin. Christine.
Thank you, Sheila. I just wanted to make more of an observation just about this idea of, you know, what comes to mind in hearing all the presentations is the transnational, or this notion of contact zones or crossroads that I know, Sheila, you are an expert in this field of research, but it just struck me that more of an observation that, you know, this is tourism, or whatever you might call it, is where people contact. And that can be, as we can see, for the worse or the better. And it doesn't even necessarily mean it will be human, as Ken's paper points out. What about that sense of contact or relationality between humans and the land? So I just think it's so interesting to see these papers all against each other on that notion of how we are at crossroads profoundly, and we can, I think, as Kathryn Owens said, treat them with, or Ken said, the dignity and the respect with which we could engage with them, but that we need contact zones, and we need the contact between things and land and people. You know, so I don't think we just all need to be guilty tourists.
Great. Thank you very much, Christine. Great point. Next.
Could I just toss something in, Sheila, in response to that?
Yeah, absolutely can, yeah.
There's a wonderful paper by a Cree scholar named Willie Ehrman called The Ethical Space of Engagement, where he talks about places where settlers and Indigenous peoples can engage with each other without appropriation or stepping on each other or otherwise exploiting each other. And it's one of the papers that one of my supervisors encouraged me to read, and it's been very helpful.
Could you put that in the chat, Ken, if possible?
Yeah, sure.
That's possible, but thank you. That's an excellent point. Moving along then to Carol Schick's question. Carol, did you want to ask your question?
No, go ahead.
Okay, wait a minute.
Oh, well, maybe I'll add something to it.
Okay.
Okay, so I don't, so the question is about knowing, Ken, that you've walked in so many beautiful places, but haven't been, is it that you've learned that even here in this place that's actually quite ugly, I just want to tell people who haven't seen this, this is kind of soul destroying when you drive through it and look at it. And perhaps I'm revealing my own bias against it. The politics annoy me greatly, but is it that you've come to this conclusion that you've decided even here in this place that's so fraught, that what you noticed elsewhere where it was much more beautiful, that there is connection? Is that what you're saying here? Or is that too simple?
No, that's very much so. There are places close to Regina where you can walk and it's quite beautiful. But you have to drive to get to them. And I decided with this project, I wasn't going to do that. And so these are the places that you see when you walk in and around the city, and especially when you get to the outskirts, the edgelands, as Phil describes them in his paper. It's not attractive. It's interesting. It's really interesting. Such a strange juxtaposition of things. It's very curious, but aesthetically pleasing, not so much. The sky, yeah, the bird song, you know, when the wind drops down low and that you can hear them. I mean, it's not a landscape that's entirely without its charms, but there is a brutalism to industrial agriculture, to the highway, to the warehouse park that is could easily make one feel dispirited.
Sheila, can I contribute?
Yes, Phil, please do.
I'm not going to turn my video on in the attempt to maintain connection. Just to say that there's a sort of strange, a sort of reverse of what Ken's just been talking about, just on the outskirts, just beyond Plymouth where I live, and we have this big national park, Dartmoor, which is generally regarded in sort of popular discourse as a place of great beauty, and yet it's a heavily traduced landscape, and it's the traducing has been repeated and has been conducted over millennia. I mean, from its first deforestation and then extreme tin mining that took place, ripping up large areas of the surface of it. Those scars are still evident, the depletion of the peat, and there's all sorts of things that, and nowadays it's essentially grazed by sheep and cattle, which means that it's becoming dominated by a particular and single kind of moor grass. So there's huge problems around it, and yet within popular discourse it continues to be this place of great beauty. So there's this strange inversion there, where yes, those landscapes are very striking. There are great tors, great stone granite tors rising up, and strange little wizened woods occasionally appearing down in the valleys, and people find those very attractive to go and visit, and yet at the same time that it's an abject landscape.
Thanks, Phil. That's a great point to add to the discussion. Okay, so next we have Whitney.
Hi, thank you so much to everyone who has presented and asking questions. All of your research has been thrilling to listen to, and I could have so many questions, but I'm going to start with one just because I'm so curious about it. Phil, this question is for you, but I am open to anyone contributing to answering it. I am curious, after the really lovely land acknowledgement, I think it was you who said that that this isn't necessarily really done where you live. And I used to live in the UK, and but I was a young child, and I was just curious, because this is pretty standard practice, although approached differently by each individual who's doing one in Canada. And I was curious if there is anything sort of, I suppose, acknowledging colonialism in the UK that is sort of like that, if that makes sense. And if you need clarification, please let me know, because I know it's sort of a tricky question.
Yeah, hi Whitney. I don't think that was me, so I think I better leave that to who. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Phil. Sorry, Ivan.
That's okay, no problem. Oh, should I answer it then?
Sure,
Well, it really struck me, and it struck me partly because of the nature of the site that I visit, which is not in the UK, and it's a very difficult site for a huge number of reasons and a huge number of people. Yet any concept of it, of the notion of land acknowledgement, which is a new idea to me, is certainly in the politics and culture of the country where the site is doesn't exist. I don't think it's a sort of and I've never come across it, but I'm certainly going to examine it further and see how it speaks to the work I'm doing, because I have a lot of issues around that sort of. To me, it's like the town at Oświęcim and also at Krakow, where I fly to Krakow. I always think of it as a Jewish town without Jews. It's a very touristy Jewish style town, but there are really no Jews in it, and it's like a sort of an absence that always strikes me. So there's something going on there that's you know, there are a lot of issues around that. I won't get drawn into that, but
just to pick that up, Whitney, it would be fascinating to try to develop a land acknowledgement for the area where I'm presently living, and it would become extremely complex. So, for example, the people who were living here 2,000 years ago, when the Romans invaded and tried to impose their culture, are actually still here. That genetic surveys show that those people who were there are actually still around. But because of the arrival of Christianity a few hundred years or not very long after the Romans actually left, the cultures that those people had essentially disappeared. I mean, there's some debate and speculation as to whether in some sort of folk memories and traditions, some of that culture somehow permeated through into the sort of medieval period. But because there is no written record, and there's very little cultural archaeological evidence, that there was a massive sort of cultural schism, so to speak, between the culture that those people had and that survived the Roman invasion, but it didn't survive the arrival of Christianity. So but those people are still there, and they are, as you know, as what's the word, they're as much the landowners as they are those that are exploited and deprived within that. And they would have been the miners who I mentioned in the paper that Ken so wonderfully read, was that they became the miners who took the silver out of the ground, that went to the mint, that minted the coins, that bought the navies, that went, you know, that went under Hawkins and Drake and people like that, and went and enslaved and colonized. So it's an incredibly complex story here.
Thanks very much. That's a great explanation, and I think it speaks to the fact that there's no cookie cutter method for processes of decolonization and reconciliation around the globe. So thank you for bringing that in, Whitney. We'll move to what is possibly our last question from Kathleen Irwin.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for 3 really wonderful and rich, sophisticated, poetic explorations of walking and placemaking. And I guess I had 3 questions, but Sheila has just mentioned that we're running out of time, so I'll start with the first one. And it's really on the macro level about artistic research and the nature of artistic research. And it's kind of a simplistic question, I think, but I want to ask it anyway. And I wonder if any one of you could characterize your work within the question of outcomes, and if you would characterize, you've each suggested that the work that you do is reflective and has social critique built into it, and often self-critique brought into it, and that makes it even richer. But in terms of artistic research practice, are these projects sort of places of quiet reflection, or do you hope that they will instigate some kind of Brechtian action or Brechtian outcome? Where do you position yourself as agential artists, if anyone wants to speak to that?
That's a difficult question. I do have an outcome, And that outcome will be the creative nonfiction manuscript that I've been working on. And if at some point that manuscript ever finds an audience, and who knows if it will, then yes, I hope that it would do something. But what exactly I hope it would do, I think perhaps encourage people to reflect in their own way about their own relationship to place or to land. And I'm not sure if that's enough, but I'm also cautious about making big claims about, you know, that then I can't deliver, writing checks that my book can't cash, as it were.
Would the rest of the panelists like to address this point? Perhaps this is our sum up point.
Well, I'm happy to have a go, but I saw that Kathryn had she was unmuted, and I don't know whether you want to speak, Kathryn.
Yeah, Chris, you might want to just cut in at any point if I go off on a tangent. So this is something that we're like thinking about currently as we're writing everything up, really. And I guess it's quite hard to separate that question from the theory that we're using. So like drawing on aspects of the hauntological and drawing on aspects of like literary theory. So we make these objects that are intended to be played with, and the hope with that is that the act of engaging with it, the imaginative process that you go through to play with an object or to read a text or to listen to an audio piece, that the reader or the audience then form their own relationship with that they either connect to their own experiences directly relating to precarity, or that they then go on to like reinterpret that work to make their own performance work, whether that's their own walk or their own score or their own way of moving about their house or their own way of charting their emotional relationship to their workplace and their experiences of labor, like whatever that might be. Yeah, so I guess like it's more quiet than like a Brechtian outcome, but there is an action there at the same time. So it's hope that like by reflecting on that relationship, yeah, so I'm starting to drift off on a tangent, but we think a lot about the role of friendship as a place, as a political place, and a place where activism might begin, and I suppose like that collaborative relationship between us and the reader is also how we think about friendship. So there's a link there in terms of like that the imagination in processing. I don't know if I've been very clear at all there, but yeah.
I would just also add to that. I think that we, like as Ken was just mentioning there, that the text or the piece of work that he's working on might not have kind of found a home yet. In a similar way, I think some of our work hasn't necessarily found like, not a home, I think you said the word audience, but we might not have found like a specific audience to the work, but that's like absolutely, when we're making the work, is our intention that it will have an outcome and will go beyond ourselves and will become something that other people engage with and connect to and use, and kind of what that ends up being is kind of something that we can't have control over, but something that is really important to our process of making and thinking of the potentiality of what the work can do and what it could do.
And I think just to add to that as well, like in terms of the scale of that, we think that even if something's like shared just amongst friends or shared just amongst people that it's like gifted to, that we have that direct relationship with, that's still useful and that's still doing something. So it's, yeah, the outcome doesn't have to be huge for it to still be an outcome.
Great, thank you for addressing that.
Phil and Ivan, did you want sort of a final word on this topic before we wrap up?
Very, very quickly, Sheila, just to say, I mean, yeah, I've always been about the Brechtian thing, you know, my research and work has been all about sort of providing handbooks and agitating people to do things. So that's, I think, why I found it so difficult to write the paper or the presentation for today, because it's forced me, it's kind of crystallized and brought together a lot of feelings that I've had recently, which is just how difficult the circumstances and how weak so many of the allies are that I've looked to in the past. And I don't think it helps to pretend that things are better than they are, and that instead it's necessary when things are difficult to actually try to find ways through from the difficulties rather than trying to skirt them or ignore them. Yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, and I'd just like to say, well, as for outcomes, I mean, my aim when I started this whole research project really was to see if I could find a way of talking about subjects that were already hugely examined and trawled over the years, and to try by example to demonstrate ways of sort of reviving difficult subjects that have been sort of burnt out by over-examination. And I mean, that's a big project, and I don't want to think that it's going to succeed, but certainly for me personally, it's set me off in all sorts of directions. So maybe I can put something out into the world.
Great. Well, thank you. This has been extremely stimulating. I don't see any other questions or hands. Thank you very much. It's nice to see Barbara Launder on here, Medri Purdom, some old friends from the past. Nice to see you guys. Excellent presentations and discussion has been so stimulating, and I think we will be continuing this discussion long after this event. So I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of you, all of the presenters for such rich presentations, to the organizers for such a great event. Thank you so much, and take care, everyone.
If I could just say before people go, I would like to really thank Sheila Petty for moderating. On that notion of outcomes, I would really like to thank Ken Wilson for the inaugural DRS Doctoral Research Showcase. I think it's been just a great success. The panelists, Phil, Kathryn, Ivan, and Chris, just wonderful presentations. And also just to thank you very much to Charity Marsh at the HRI and the deans of FGSR and MAP, Aziz Douai and Ray Stasison, for being here and really giving us a great launch to this initiative. And I don't quite know, but into the future, we're going to have our next doctoral research showcase presenter, perhaps a few months down the line. So thank you everyone for being here, and we really appreciate it. And have a great and beautiful day on Treaty 4 territory.
Bye, thank you.
Thanks.
Bye, thank you.